Chapter 14, Home Sweet Humphreyville. Cling, 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 heary, heary. The town of Humphreyville welcomes you. That was AJ ringing a bell and wearing a funny three-cornered hat. I guess Miss Brisbane picked him to be the town crier because he had the loudest voice in the class.
It's 7 o'clock and all is well. Your tour guides will now show you around the town after 2 weeks of excitement and lots of hurried, scurried, hard work. Parents' night finally arrived.
I'm so used to being alone in the quiet classroom with on weeknights with a visit from Aldo. That it was strange but wonderful to see the whole room filled with my classroom families.
I knew most of them from my visits to their houses, AJ and all the Thomases, the Tugwells, Heidi and Gail and their families, the Rinaldis, the Patels, and all the Golden family except the dog, Clem, thank goodness, including her mom, dad, stepmom, brother Ben, and stepsister Abby.
Even Paul and his mom were there. The class had voted to make him a full citizen of Humphreyville.
Even Paul and his mom were there. The class had voted to make him a full citizen of Humphreyville. Each student got to be a tour guide, showing his or her own family the houses, streets, park, and yes, the statue of me. There was a pleasant hubbub as the families admired the houses. Funny, all the parents thought the very best house was made by their own kid.
Hiya, Humphrey, a familiar voice said. It was Seth's grandmother, Dot Larrabee. She was all dressed up and had bright red lips and fingernails. I hardly recognized her. Still, the daring young man on the flying trapeze. I flung myself at my climbing ladder to prove that I was. After a half hour of oohing and eyeing over Humphreyville, AJ rang his bell again. Clang, 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 heary, heary, clang, clang, clang. The town meeting will now come to order. AJ sure liked running that bell. He rang it a few more times until Mrs. Brisbane told him that was enough. She asked the parents to take the seats. Mostly they sat in the kid-sized chairs, though they looked a bit silly. Although brought in some folding chairs too. The students stood so their parents could sit down. Mind if I stick around? Aldo asked. I'd be disappointed if you didn't, Mrs. Brisbane told him. The entire Payne family arrived a little late. Mr. and Miss Payne, Mandy, Pammy, Tammy, and Brian, of course. I thought Miss Payne worked at night. Clang, clang, clang. AJ certainly knew how to get people's attention. Hear ye, presenting Miss Payne. The parents clapped, and Miss Brisbane came to the front of the room. It's great to have such a big turnout tonight. I know it's hard work to get here after a long day, but I wanted to share with you all the work your children have put into building their own community from scratch. I think they did a wonderful job, don't you?
The families clapped even louder. AJ clapped too, and dropped his bell with a large clang. Boing, boing, said Og. Maybe he thought the bell was another frog. Anyway, everybody laughed. Miss Brisbane said it was time to introduce our special guest, Mr. Dudley Dalton, a member of our own town city council, a tall, very thin man with large round glasses and a skinny mustache came to the center of the room. When the clapping stopped, he cleared his throat and pulled a piece of paper out of his suit coat pocket.
Thank you, Mrs. Brisbane, he said. I am honored to be here to share this evening with these wonderful young people of Longfellow School. Truly, they are a credit to our community. He smiled slightly as a smiling hurt his face. Since we've had a look at Humphrey Ville tonight, I'd like to share with you some background about our own town and how it's grown over the years. Mr. Dudley Dalton unfolded the paper and began to read, and read, and read. Instead of reading something like a story, he read facts and figures, dates and something he called statistics, which were harder to understand than the hardest vocabulary word we have ever had.
All the parents and students tried hard to concentrate on what Mr. Dallant was saying, but as he went on and on, it was harder to pay attention. If only he made the reading of his statistics as interesting as Mrs. Brisbane makes her story sound. Soon I saw Seth start to fidget. His sister Lucinda gave him a hard jab in the ribs with her elbow, and he settled down again. Mr. and Mrs. Payne looked a little drowsy, and when I glanced at my friend Dot, I saw her eyes were closed and her chin was dropping. Didn't Mr. Dudley Dallant notice that he was putting his audience to sleep? I guess not, since he never looked up from his paper, not once.
Everyone tried hard to pay attention until Mr. Dalton got stuck on the word economics. It's a hard word, I'll admit, but when he said economics, Gail started giggling. And what's worse, Gail's mom started giggling too. Mr. Dalton corrected himself, economics. And that pretty much sums up the growth of this wonderful community that we all call home. He folded up his paper and everyone applauded, probably because they were relieved that he had finished. When everyone clapped, Dot's eyes opened wide. Her head jerked up and she said, "Oh," rather loudly. The applause had stopped, so Miss Brisbane asked her if she had a question.
Dot stood up. Not a question, just a comment. Facts and figures are fine, but what makes up a community is people. And I've known some pretty doggone interesting people in my lifetime here. "Mother," Mrs. Stevenson whispered, "sit down." "Grandma," Lucinda whispered, "please." But Mrs. Brisbane smiled. I couldn't agree more. That encouraged Dot to keep going. I was hoping she'd tell the story of the dancing bear. "For example, when I was growing up here," Lucinda groaned loudly and Seth squirmed in his chair, but that didn't stop Dot. "I grew up in a yellow house with white trim down on Alder Street. They were nice houses down there with big trees around and a store on the corner. Even though it wasn't as big as this room, you could find anything you'd want in that store." "Where Panorama is now?" I squeaked. I hadn't planned on saying anything. It just slipped out. Gail and her mom started giggling again. That didn't stop Dot either.
You kids like them all, but did you know there used to be a roller skating rink there? With an amusement park next door, it had a merry-go-round and a Ferris wheel. Only cost $0.25 to get in. Oh, and there were pony rides too. Boy, I have to say, Dot had everyone's attention now. Mr. Dudley Dalton nervously folded and refolded his paper while she talked. "When you talk about history, you have to know the facts and figures, sure.
You also have to know how people lived, what they did, how they thought, and what they did for fun. Dot was running out of steam, or else she was getting tired of Lucinda tugging on her skirt, trying to get her to sit down. Anyway, that's my opinion. She sat down. Lucinda, Mrs. Stevenson, and Seth all acted pretty nervous, but then a nice thing happened. People began to applaud, not for Dudley Dalton of the City Council, but for Dot. Mrs. Brisbane clapped too. When the applause died down, Mrs. Brisbane said, "Class, I think we found our next social studies project. I think we should get out and interview people like Mrs. Larrabee and find out what life used to be in this town. You can talk to your parents, your grandparents, your neighbors. Mr. Brisbane works down at the senior center. I think that would also be a good place to meet people. What do you think, Mr. Dalton?" "A fine idea," he said, running a handkerchief across his forehead. "People are a finest resource." Mrs. Brisbane did a good job of wrapping things up so that people could go home. Instead of leaving, parents and their children gathered around Dot, asking her questions about the amusement park and Alder Street, and saying they'd like to get together. Dot's skin was rosy, and she was smiling a lot more than when I'd stayed at the house.
"I think Grandma's a star," I heard Seth's mother tell her children. "Great," said Lucinda, rolling her eyes dramatically. It turns out that Dot wasn't the only one drawing a crowd. The entire Pan family gathered around my cage. For the first time since I've known them, they were all smiling at once. "Here's our guy," said Miss Payne. "Yes, sir, Humphrey. We owe you all thanks. I'm sorry you had to go to the vets, but if you hadn't, I never would have gotten that job at the veterinary clinic." "A good job, too. Nice people and nice animals," said Mr. Payne. "Yippee! He not only got the job, but he liked it. I think I'm going to take some classes so I can get promoted," he added. "Yippee, yippee, yippee! Without you, I wouldn't have been able to go back on the day shift and spend more time with the kids," said Mr. Payne.
"And I wouldn't have gotten my very own hamster," said Manny. "You know, Winky. He's the cutest hamster I've ever seen. Next to you, of course." Winky, the toothless, one-eyed hamster, had a real home. "Thanks, Humphrey. You can come to our house any time," said Mrs. Payne. "Next time I get to hold them," said Pammy. "No, I get to hold them," said Tammy. Me too, said Brian. "Some things don't ever change, I guess." Winky had his paws full, living at the Payne's house. Somehow I knew he could handle it. Later that night, after Aldo took away the folding chairs, it was quiet in room 26, except for the tick-tick-tick of the clock. I spent some time writing about the evening's events in my notebook. The moon was full and bright. Even in the moonlight, I could see buds of green on the trees outside. The evening was warm, March was almost over, and just as Dot had predicted, it was going out like a lamb. "Og," I finally squeaked. "Og, are you awake?" I heard some gentle splashing, so I knew he couldn't be sleeping. Room 26 was a pretty special place. Don't you agree? Og replied with a friendly, agreeable boing.
I glanced across the room. There was the town of Humphreyville spread across several tables in the moonlight. It looked even more like a real town than during the day. It would all be over soon, of course. Miss Brisbane was going to let my friends take their houses home with them. The room would go back to the way it used to be. I crouched down and pushed up on the lock with all my might. The door swung open. "It's a lovely night for a stroll," I told Og. "Sorry you can't join me." Boing! Og started bouncing so high he might as well have been on a trampoline. What was he trying to tell me now? Boing, 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 scree! My old pal did it again. He popped the top of his tank, leaped out, and landed on the bag of Nutri-Nibbles nearby.
I must admit, I was worried when I saw him there. It took a lot of effort for him to bounce up high enough to get out of his tank. But how on earth was he going to bounce back in? And if he was out of the water for too long, he could be in big trouble. But he was already out of his tank, and there wasn't a thing I could do about it, except enjoy his company. "It's a lovely night for a stroll," I repeated, "and I'm so glad you can join me." Og and I scurried along our table, and we reached Humphrey Ville. The table he was on was quite a bit lower than ours. I remembered what Aldo had said about broken bones, so instead of jumping, I lowered myself by my paws and dangled there for a second, then gently dropped down. I landed pretty hard and even did a somersault, but we hamsters are really good acrobats. Og had no problem making the big leap.
There we were, on the main street of Humphrey Ville, Taco Boulevard. For the first time, I realized that the houses were just the right size for a hamster like me or for a frog like Og. We strolled past AJ's house of blocks, which was next door to Miranda's purple castle. Across the street was a long drawing of shops, a movie theater, a bowling alley, even a pet store, which all of my friends had worked on. We turned down Basketball Avenue, past Garth's log cabin, which was next door to a small house with a large basketball court. That was Tabitha's house, naturally. She loved sports more than anything. On Soccer Street, we saw Seth's rocket ship's house. Sarah's apartment building stood across from Art's amazing merry-go-round house, with the slide coming down, the train tracks going through it.
Across the street was a smaller version of Art's house. It was Paul's place, of course. Video Game Way crossed at the corner, and there was Gail's bright yellow house with a picket fence, and around it was flowers painted on it. Pizza Place had a pizza parlor, as well as a courthouse with its cardboard pillars and a clock up on top. On this clock, it was always 12 o'clock. That meant it was either noon or midnight. Which on the courthouse was the school playground. We turned down a recessed lane, which led to a large park, and the playground and a baseball diamond. The grassy Og Frog Nature Preserve has been moved to the one side of the park. "Nice sign," I said. "I'll twang in agreement." We stopped in the center of the park and stared at the tall statue. There I was, larger than life, and golden. Even a golden hamster was never that gold before. On the base of the statue, it read, "To Humphrey, a friend in need is a friend indeed."
It's a funny kind of saying, but I thought about it and realized it's true. March had roared in like a lion, blowing in a whole lot of trouble for the students in room 26. Seth's jitters, Art's failing grades, Mandy's unhappy family, and especially Miranda's punishment for something she didn't do. These were my friends, and I did my best to help them. Now March was ending, and all those troubles had blown away with the blustery winds. Tomorrow, Humphreyville would be gone, but my friends would still be there, and Mrs. Brisbane, Aldo, and Og as well. We walked through the town and headed back for our table. I was relieved to see that Og had no trouble hopping up on the table. He then leaped to the Nutri-Nibbles bag, bounced his way up to the top, and then, with one enormous leap, jumped back into the tank, where he landed with an impressive splash. "Well done, Augie," I complimented him. Of course tomorrow Mrs. Brisbane would find the top of his tank and wonder about it, but somehow I wasn't worried.
Once I was back in the safety of my cage, I felt unsqueakably happy. You know what, Og? We turned out to have the best jobs of all. The classroom pets of room 26. Boing, 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 Og agreed. I'm absolutely positive that he was saying yes. Families proclaim Humphreyville to be the perfect community. Students say they'll always think of Humphreyville as their hometown. The Humphreyville Herald.
Humphrey's tips for staying out and getting out of trouble. Number 1, if you make a mistake and get in trouble, it's always a good idea to admit you're wrong and say you're sorry.
Number 2, sometimes you get in trouble for something you didn't do. Try and stay calm, but squeak up for yourself and explain what really happened. This doesn't always work, but you can try.
Go.
3, if you get in trouble and lie about it, you'll only get in more trouble, so always speak the truth.
4, when a good friend, like Miranda, gets in trouble, sometimes you feel as bad as your friend does. That's what friends are for.
5, when a good friend like Art or Seth gets in trouble, a good friend like Paul or me can sometimes lend an ear or a paw and help out.
Number 8, if you think you have troubles, think of someone worse off than you are, like my friend Winky, the reject hamster, whose troubles are happily over now. Number 9, a famous writer named Sophocles once said, trouble brings upon trouble upon trouble. I'm having trouble figuring that one out. Number 10, another famous writer named George Herbert said, he that seeks trouble never misses. Now that I understand, so don't go looking for trouble, please. And remember, everyone gets in trouble at some time, even classroom hamsters and teachers. So if trouble comes your way, don't worry, you're in good company.